Hi, welcome to the first series of Facts and Other Fairy Tales. The reason I'm starting with this one is because I really want you to have an understanding of my ethos and also to empower everyone to be better consumers of information. That means not just blindly accepting or rejecting information just because it happens to agree with your point of view. For me, in a modern multi-platform world, this is the most important thing that we can do as citizens, consumers, and activists. There is absolutely a proliferation of pish out there because people fail to think critically and fail to really evaluate information effectively. So if we're going to be evaluating information, I really can't think of a better place to start than this.
Why did he do that? It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office on day one.
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains
alternative facts for the.
So right, we now live in a world of alternative facts where we debate what is true versus what isn't true, and on no really good basis. So we start with the anti-vaxxers as a good example. Vaccinations help, but then the free thinkers survive. They put out information that has absolutely no bearing on any level of reality. And if that isn't bad enough, then we also have the crazy climate deniers. And I'm sorry if you're one of them, but you are crazy. These people take information that 97% of all researchers say is right, is good, is verifiable, and what's worse is that these people, the people in Congress, they're not ill-informed, they're just lying, and because they carry weight, they carry influence, other people believe them, people who don't have the time to look at, oh so thrilling world of academic research. So let's take a quick reference on what it actually means to have source credibility. Let's start with the basics. There are two types of sources. The first type of sources are their primary sources. Primary sources produce new knowledge. It's original research. So if you want to think about it this way, something that's replicable, verifiable, that, if you explained how you did it, someone else could come along, do the same thing, and then you could compare your results to see how it worked. It's all about transparency. And of course, not all primary sources are created equal. There can be misleading or problematic ones. That's why it's all about transparency. Then the second type of source is a secondary source. So we summarize what's existing knowledge, we try and compile research from a lot of different places, hopefully, to draw new conclusions out of it. So this can range from anything from fact-checking, response pieces, compilation pieces, news roundups. And this is really most of the information that we consume on a regular basis. Most books, magazines, newspapers, TV, and yes, YouTube content. But again, not all secondary sources are created equal. So how do we figure out what's a good source and what's a bad source? Let's evaluating them using the best acronym ever, CRAP. This is a test or a check for good source credibility. The first kind of question we ask is whether the information is recent enough. So you ask, what's the date of the original publication, and does the date matter? If we're talking about the War of 1812, a source from 1950 might be just as good as a source from today. But if we're talking about technology, politics, anything like that, sources from the 1950 obviously aren't going to be as good as today. Second, relevance is an evaluation of the clear and logical connection to evaluating the truthfulness of the claim. Does the information presented help us to evaluate the assertion? Third, authority. Is the source knowledgeable about the topic? Now, you can have someone who is perfectly qualified, which is an important part of authority, but they could have a serious bias. Now, it's okay if someone has a perspective. And it can be a perspective that you don't necessarily agree with. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should discount their information. What we have to do is to see if the way that they're putting together their information in and of itself is problematic. But so you look at their background, is to take a look at the publication quality. In terms of publication quality, peer review, because what it means is that other experts have blindly review a piece of research. I don't know whose research it is. I take a look at it and I ask the question, is this a good piece of research? Does it advance the knowledge in our field? So that tends to be viewed as the best sources of information. Is it edited? If you have that kind of an interaction, a lot of times that tends to ferret out bad information, so it's kind of the second tier. That doesn't mean it's not credible, it just means that it's not as rigorous as peer review. And then there's the third level, which goes through no checks. If we're trying to make an argument that isn't subject to peer review, isn't subject to editing, then if we want to be credible, we ought to use good information to borrow from their credibility. Next is accuracy. This is an evaluation of the reliability or truthiness of the content. It asks the question, has someone presented sufficient evidence to support their point? If there is contradictory evidence, and there usually is it directly addressed? That doesn't mean putting it down as stupid. And can you make an argument for why your information answers or addresses those problems? So there should always be substance behind the information, a way to verify that it's true and that it fairly represents the viewpoint. Then finally is purpose. This is an evaluation of the reasons that the information has been presented. What's its purpose? To inform, to persuade, to teach, to entertain. Any of these are legitimate purposes, but it helps us to evaluate whether the information is good or not. So how does author affiliation affect the point of view? If you know that someone's liberal, conservative, somewhere in between, it certainly is a clue. It doesn't mean that you accept or reject. It just gives you a way of better understanding the nature of the source. And then finally, is the information presented in good faith? We have inherent biases just as well as any other of the authors do, any content creator does. So how do you check your own bias? Well, it turns out that there are quite a big list of factors that can influence whether we fairly consider information. So the first is our own personal biases. Just like the bias can affect someone who creates content, it can also affect how we receive it. When we hear something, we may not be listening. If I know, for example, I really, really hate the InfoWars guys. They cause me pain and suffering. But I know this. I want to give them a fair listen. I know that I have to put my personal bias against them to the side and actually consider the information they present on its merits. Second, there are also environmental factors that affect how well we can listen. Are we cranky? Are we hot? Are we hungry? All of this stuff can really influence our willingness to listen to someone else. Third, people have an decreasing attention span. When I started in academia, it used to be about 15 minutes was the average attention span. About 7-8 years ago, the research suggested that was down to 5 to 7 minutes. Now the estimates are down that our attention span starts waning after about a minute. One of the naughty things that we tend to do, though, is as soon as we hear something that we think we're going to disagree with, we start responding in our head. As soon as we start thinking about why we don't like it, we've stopped listening. We also tend to daydream a bit. But then we also have to know what triggers us. The final bit of this is that we tend to filter information. Look, we're exposed to something like 10,000 messages a day. If we actually paid attention, would be completely overloaded. So what that means is that we're really good at subconsciously filtering out information that we just don't like, that we don't agree with, stuff that we might not be interested in. Our subconscious filters automatically kick in. We can minimize personal bias and so our inability to listen by first taking notes. This helps a whole host of problems. What this also lets you do is let you think about what triggers you. You can stay focused on the information and start to try and ignore the triggers so that you can ignore them a little bit more effectively. One thing you should absolutely always try to do is be able to recap the information that you've had. This doesn't mean that you have to agree with it, but you should be able to summarize what was said in a way would recognize as being an accurate and fair representation of their information. Don't preempt or respond until you hear the whole message. All too often, if we're hearing something we don't like, we assume that the speaker or the writer has some kind of negative, evil, strategic intention, that they're trying to manipulate us. It's usually not the case. Most of the time, even if we disagree with someone, if you assume that everyone's coming to an interaction with a positive intention, they're not trying to manipulate, not trying to control, you end up listening much more effectively. If we can practice listening more authentically and consciously reduce our own biases in information consumption, we're better able to learn. Now, this never means we have to change our opinions. What it means is that we have to have a more honest understanding about those with whom we disagree. It also means that we have to humanize the people with whom we disagree, because if we treat them as equals, who just happen to disagree with us, then we have to recognize that they have genuine reasons for the ways that they see the world, reasons that are just as genuine as the way we see the world. And at that point, if we can't treat people with a bit of respect, then we're assholes. And likewise, if they can't treat us with a bit of respect, they're assholes. So yes, I'm talking to the social justice warrior types on the left, as well as the red pill MGTOW alt-right types on the right. To be blunt, both sides are being assholes online, in the mainstream media, and interpersonally, because both are unwilling to listen to one another. You guys only seem to be looking for perspectives and voices that agree with yours, and you're blindly and uncritically following the influencers and opinion leaders without ever critically evaluating the information that you're consuming. You're both just as bad as each other, and I'm coming for both sides with evidence, reason, and by doing proper research. I am the Cranky Academic. I read a bunch of boring academic research reports and white papers so that you don't have to.